Jimmy here again. Part 2 of reloading the Berger VLD bullet for my hunting setup, which is a Sako 75 in 30-06. So where I'm at right now is I am done with my brass prep, where I needed to fire form this brass. So I went out to the range today. Last night loaded up 30 rounds just with some cheap varmint bullets for my 30-06. Fire formed all of those. That went great. Threw them in the tumbler. I just like clean brass. I want to avoid getting the soot build up inside my dies. So I threw it in the tumbler for a couple hours today, and now I'm in the process of reloading. So the first thing before I can start reloading any of this brass is I need to understand the bullet seating depth for my rifle. And this is a critical step, as I talked about in part 1, that jump from the cartridge to the lands. There's a lot of good topics and information that needs to be understood on this that you should really read on if you don't understand it. But basically, I need to get a benchmark on my rifle with this specific bullet on where it sits in the lands, what the distance is. So what I'm in the middle of doing right now is basically this is kind of an old school method for determining this. There are tools now from Hornady that you can purchase that will speed this process up and kind of make it a bit easier, but this process works quite well and it's what I'm familiar with. So what I do is I have, this is not the Nosler brass, but this is some fire formed brass. This is Winchester, and we're not going to be loading this brass, but it'll work for what we need to do here. So it's trimmed to the same length, and I have neck sized this very loosely. You don't want a really hard clamp on the bullet at this point. We want the bullet to let go in the rifling if we're jammed into the rifling pretty good. So I have my redding die set, and it's backed off quite a bit. So it's barely going to seat the bullet, and I'm actually on step 2 of the progression. I'll kind of walk through this. So again, single stage press. We're going to go ahead and seat this bullet, and I'm just going to readjust this just by a couple thousandths. Okay. So now the bullet is seated, and if you can see that, it's way out. It's probably still going to be in the rifling pretty good. And what I do next is I take a marker and just color in all the way around on that transition from the ogive and a little bit before it up onto the flat. And we want that all colored in. Just get that dried off a little bit. And the reason for that is I want, if that bullet comes out, I want to see the marks from the lands on it. Because again, we're trying to determine where, how far out I am seating this before it touches the lands. Where is it just into the lands, just, you know, a couple thousandths in at most. Now I'm going to take a overall length of this before I try it in the rifle. That's really key. Okay, perfect. Write this down, 3.5135. Okay, now you're not going to see this on the camera, but I am going to hand load this into the rifle and slowly close the bolt. And basically what's going to happen is either the bullet is going to get pushed into the cartridge, or more likely the bullet is going to get stuck in the lands of my rifle and I'll have to pull that back out. But that's okay, because in this process, again, I'm moving out less than a 10,000th each time, and at some point the bullet's going to come out in the case, and I'm not going to have those marks where the Sharpie is, and that I'm going to have a measurement then where my rifle is engaging. So just doing this, and did it come out? No, the bullet is stuck in the lands. So here's the empty brass, and that bullet is in the lands. It's not in there hard. You just take a cleaning rod and very carefully tap it out from the other end, which I'll do in a minute here. But again, I'm going to keep this process up until I get that measurement, and that measurement is going to be my starting point. And we'll come back in just a second with that once I reach that point. Okay, so now what we have here is a seating depth that is not getting locked up in my rifling. I can see the marks on the Sharpie where I can see that brass still shining through, and if you actually look, you're not going to be able to see this on the camera, but I can see that the lands are just there, just faintly. So I know I'm still touching the lands. I must be barely into them. It's not pulling the bullet out, and I'll probably keep backing this off a little bit, a few 10,000ths at a time, until I don't see these. But basically on paper here I had to go through, and I was with my micrometer on the competition seating die, I was moving the seating depth in by 10,000ths each time. I think that's a good amount there to be moving that by. And then finally at one of the measurements, it finally pushed. I could feel the chamber or the bolt push it in just a little bit, and it came out with the bullet in. So I took a measurement when it came out, and that's the importance of taking that measurement before going in. And so I have that difference there, but this is getting really close. So the next step, and I already did this with another one you can see here, my measurements were really close with that one, is how does this fit in the magazine? And we can see that this is not going to clear the magazine. So what we do then is zero out our caliper here. This is a little trick my dad, who's a machinist, showed me, just to clean out your calipers and zero them on a piece of paper. And we're zeroed. And we're going to measure the inside dimension of this magazine. Okay, and we'll write that down. And what I'm going to do that, why I'm doing that is I want the difference between my final seating depth, where I feel like it's just touching the lands, and the inside of the magazine, because as this is for a hunting application, I need my rounds to actually cycle and load in the magazine. So I'm not going to be able to have them seated out all the way into the lands. And I can see that I'm only going to be 30 thousandths off from being able to fit in the magazine, and I'll probably give myself another 10 thousandths on top of that. So as I talked about in the first video, there's a progression that Berger wants you to load for a jump to the lands, and they actually have you start with it jammed 10 thousandths into the lands and moving out from there. And so with mine not being able to be into the lands and fit the magazine at the same time, I'm going to have to start at the number 2 in the progression, 50 thousandths off the lands. I have enough room from where my start on the lands is. It's going to be really close, but I should be able to be 50 thousandths off the lands, and that will be the closest I can seat the bullet to the lands and still have that fit in my magazine. So that'll be my starting mark. Real quickly, just a few other things to note. The cartridge base to ogive, that's what I'm going to use for all my measurements. Again, talked about in the first video that the me plat on these bullets, or the tip of the bullet, is inconsistent, and we don't want to measure off of that. We're going to use this bullet comparator on the calipers to measure. So that's what I'm going to be measuring off of and adjusting these measurements. So we'll probably go 50 thousandths. They have you jump to 90 thousandths and then 130 after that. So we can load these 3 progressions and see which one of those is shooting best, and then in round 2 maybe make some refinements to that if one of those is shooting really well. So that's how we determine our seating depth. Kind of an older school method here. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this, but that's how you do it without any specific tools. You don't want to do this just once. You want to repeat your results, and it's kind of multiple measurements and verify and confirm what you're finding there. So I'm happy that I'm not, with my specific gun here, I'm not way off the lands and still having to seat in my magazine. I don't have a ton of flexibility there. It would be nice to be into the lands and be able to experiment with that without any jump. But we want reliability in our hunting cartridge. These measurements, it should be noted that these are specific to my rifle. So the process you can follow for your own, but you don't want to consider any of these measurements applicable to your own rifle. Every chamber is different. Even another Sako 75 in 30-06 is going to be different. So now I can get to next sizing this and reloading. We'll cover that in the next part. Okay, so we have a load now. I've done my math here, and we are 30 thousandths off the lands and fitting into the magazine. So I was able to work that out where it's pretty nice round number, and man, I am really close. I mean, to the eyeball here, it looks like there's just absolutely no room. So that definitely could be a reliability issue, so that's something to consider. But for a starting point for working up these Berger VLDs, that will work for me. So again, I'm 30 thousandths off the lands, so I won't be able to use that number 1 start jumping to the actually being jammed in the lands 10 thousandths like they say. But I really don't want to be jammed in the lands anyway, because again, this is going to be a hunting round. So we'll start at 30 thousandths, go up to 50, 90, and then 130. So I'll still have a 4-stage progression that I'll work through. I'm just substituting that first one with what works in my magazine. So now that I have that determined and out of the way, we can start with reloading. I have my neck sizer die. This is the Lee die again, set on my press. It's touching the shell holder plus 1 full turn. Again, that's in the Lee directions when you set this up. And I don't do the Lee recommends that you neck size twice. I just neck size once. So I'll go through a couple of these here just to show how I do this. And it requires 25 pounds of pressure, is what Lee says, to close the collet on the die and size it. I find that this gives a pretty good hold on the bullet. Berger doesn't want you crimping bullets anyway. There's no cantilever to crimp on, and they don't want you crimping because pressure could be excessive. So for a hunting situation, you want to make sure this neck is holding decent. You don't want your bullets to get pushed into the case when they're in transport and you're in a hunting situation. So those are now deprimed and neck sized, and next I'll go through clean out the primer pockets. I just have this little cheap tool from Lee to clean the primer pockets. I'll clean those, and then we'll get into hand priming these in the next video and selecting powder and loading. Stay tuned for that.